The first thing I saw was the jagged maw in her hull, a grotesque grin just above the waterline, mocking the morning sun. Liberty, my 30-foot sanctuary, wasn't just damaged. She was violated, deliberately, brutally. She listed heavily to starboard, her proud bow canted towards the murky bottom of the slip, water already sloshing over her gunwales. It wasn't an accident. The fiberglass was shattered inwards, splintered like bone, the kind of impact that takes effort, malice. My gut clenched, a cold fist of fury. This wasn't random vandalism. This was a message, and I had a damned good idea who sent it. The Homeowners Association, or more specifically, its self-appointed empress, Karen Peterson. She'd been on a tear lately, a reign of petty terror over paint swatches and lawn height, her pronouncements delivered with the divine right of a tin-pot dictator. We'd had words. More accurately, she'd delivered shrill monologues about the aesthetic purity of the community, and I'd offered terse, monosyllabic deflections. My refusal to engage her on her level, to validate her absurd power trips, clearly hadn't sat well. But this was an escalation that beggared belief. To sink a man's boat, a vessel that represented years of saving, countless hours of cherished family memories, lazy afternoons with my wife, Sarah, and the kids learning to tie knots, the smell of salt and sunscreen, a permanent fixture. That wasn't a violation of some ridiculous bylaw. It was a desecration. My fists tightened, the knuckles white. They picked the wrong boat. They picked the wrong man. I could feel the tremor starting deep inside. Not fear, but a cold, seismic rage, the kind that settles into your marrow and demands retribution. This wasn't just about a boat anymore. This was about a fundamental breach, an act of war disguised as neighborhood squabbling. I knelt on the dock, the wood cool beneath my knees, and reached out a hand, my fingers tracing the splintered edges of the wound. The water inside was a dark mirror reflecting the sky, and in it I saw not just the dying vessel, but the smug, entitled face of its executioner. The initial shockwave of seeing Liberty dying was swiftly being overridden by a chilling clarity. This wasn't going to be a shouting match at the next HOA meeting. This wasn't going to be an insurance claim and a grumbled complaint. Oh no, this was going to be a lesson. A meticulously planned, legally precise, and utterly devastating lesson in consequences. Karen Peterson, in her infinite, self-absorbed wisdom, had just signed a warrant for her own undoing. She just didn't know what authority would be serving it. The air was still, the only sounds the gentle lapping of water against the pilings and the faint, mournful creak of Liberty as she settled further. It was the sound of a line being crossed, a line I hadn't drawn, but one I would now defend with everything I possessed. The calm that descended upon me was terrifying, even to myself. It was the eye of the storm, the quiet before the ordnance falls. My mind was already working, processing, cataloging. The angle of impact, the probable tool used, something heavy, blunt, swung with considerable force. The timing, under cover of darkness, most likely. Witnesses? Unlikely, but not impossible. The marina was quiet, but not deserted. Every detail, every possibility, began to slot into place like pieces of a complex, three-dimensional chess game. The initial rage was now being channeled, refined, into something far more dangerous. Purpose. I stood, my gaze sweeping the marina, the manicured lawns of the waterfront properties, the sterile perfection that Karen worshipped. She had sought to impose her will, to break something beautiful to assert her dominance. She would soon learn that true power wasn't found in the petty enforcement of arbitrary rules, but in the unwavering application of justice. And I was, after all, an officer of the law. More than that? Much more. The implications of that thought hung in the air, a silent promise. The sun climbed higher, casting a golden light on the scene of the crime, illuminating the ugliness of the act. It felt like a spotlight, not on my loss, but on her guilt. I took out my phone, not to call the insurance company, not yet. My first call was to a different kind of specialist. My own. The first call was to dispatch, my voice deliberately flat, devoid of the cold fire simmering beneath. Sheriff Brody. I need a forensics unit and a couple of deputies at Slip 7B, Lakeside Marina. We have a major case of malicious destruction of property. My property. A beat of silence on the other end, then a hesitant, "Sheriff? Are you all right?" I appreciated the concern in young Miller's voice, but this wasn't the time for pleasantries. "I'm fine, Miller. The boat isn't." Consider this an active crime scene. I hung up before he could ask more. They didn't know. None of them in this meticulously curated, poisonously polite little enclave knew who I really was when I clocked out. To them, I was just Mr. Brody from number 12, the quiet man with the boat, the one who didn't attend the monthly HOA coffee clatches or offer effusive praise for Karen Peterson's latest tyrannical decree about approved mailbox designs. They saw a homeowner, perhaps a bit aloof. They had no earthly idea they were harassing, and now attacking, the damn county sheriff. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it, if I weren't so focused on the coming storm. My deputies arrived within 15 minutes, sirens respectfully silent as they pulled up near the marina office. Dave Brenner, my lead investigator, a man whose craggy face had seen too much but whose eyes still held a spark of righteous indignation for true villainy, stepped out. He took one look at Liberty, then at me. His expression, usually professionally neutral, tightened. "Jesus, John, what in God's name happened here?" I gave him the briefest rundown, my voice a low monotone. "Deliberate, malicious. I want this slip cordoned off. Full forensics. Photographs, fiber samples, tool mark analysis, if possible. I want to know what she used, Dave. I want to know everything." The "she" hung in the air. Dave didn't question it. He knew my instincts. He also knew the simmering, controlled fury in my eyes meant this wasn't just another case file. This was personal, and because it was personal to me, it would be handled with the surgical precision of a vendetta cloaked in due process. The shift from victim to orchestrator was instantaneous. The moment I identified myself to dispatch, the mantle of office settled onto my shoulders, a familiar weight. The cold anger didn't dissipate. It transformed, sharpening into a laser focus. This wasn't just about my boat anymore. This was an attack on a citizen, a brazen act of criminal damage. The fact that the citizen was me, the sheriff, simply meant the perpetrator had made a catastrophic miscalculation. While my team meticulously documented the scene, dusting for prints on the dock, photographing the gash from every conceivable angle, I began my own internal investigation. Karen Peterson. She was the alpha and omega of this. Her escalating harassment, her fury at my polite but firm refusal to bow to her micromanaging. Last week it was a notice about the length of my grass, measured to the millimeter, no doubt. The week before, a passive-aggressive email about the appropriate color for deck chairs, visible from the street. Each a petty power play. This, however, this was a quantum leap. A neighbor, old Mrs. Henderson from across the way, a woman whose prize-winning roses Karen had once threatened to have ripped out for non-compliance with hedge height uniformity, shuffled over. Her face, a mask of concern and something else, a nervous excitement. "Sheriff Brody. John, I heard a commotion last night. Late. Like someone was angry. Down by the docks." Her voice was a conspiratorial whisper. "Saw that Peterson woman storming away from this direction around midnight, muttering to herself. Looked like she'd wrestled a badger and lost." My eyes met Dave's. A silent understanding passed between us. Mrs. Henderson wouldn't hold up as a sole witness to the act, but it was corroboration. It was a thread. "Thank you, Martha," I said, my voice softer. "My deputies might have a few more questions for you later, if that's all right." She nodded eagerly, a silent rebel finally seeing a chink in the HOA armor. The cogs were turning. This wasn't just going to be about criminal damage. If Karen Peterson was unhinged enough to do this, what else was she capable of? What else was festering in that HOA office, that little kingdom built on bylaws and bitterness? My boat was the catalyst, the spark. But I had a sinking feeling the fire was much, much larger. And I had the resources, the authority, and now, the profound motivation to bring the entire rotten structure crashing down. Karen Peterson. The name itself left a bitter taste, like cheap wine and stale arrogance. She was a woman sculpted from entitlement and fortified by the minor leagues of power, the kind that festers in poorly managed community associations. Her reign as HOA president was less about community improvement and more about the meticulous exercise of control, a dominatrix of dogwood planting regulations and vinyl siding edicts. I'd seen her type before, in different arenas. Small people puffed up by small authority, desperate to make their mark on the world by making others miserable. Her history in the neighborhood was a tapestry of passive aggression, outright bullying, and a delusional belief in her own infallibility. There was the incident with the Miller family's playhouse, deemed architecturally incongruous, and ordered dismantled, reducing their 6-year-old daughter to tears. Then the war on wind chimes, declared noise pollution, despite being barely audible beyond the owner's property line. Each victory, however petty, seemed to fuel her, embolden her. My own interactions had been brief, calculatedly so on my part. I'd received the barrage of emailed friendly reminders and violation notices, each one more unhinged than the last. My crime? Existing apparently without seeking her explicit approval for every breath I took on my own property. The boat, Liberty, was a particular affront to her sensibilities. It represented freedom, escape, things anathema to a control freak. She'd made comments, veiled threats disguised as concerns about marina aesthetics and slip upkeep standards. I'd met them all with the same polite gray rock indifference. It was like water off a duck's back, and I suspect that infuriated her more than open defiance would have. While forensics worked their magic on Liberty, turning her into a floating pincushion of evidence markers, I dispatched Deputy Miller, our resident tech whiz, on a different kind of hunt. "Miller," I said, my voice low and hard, "I want you to start a deep dive on Karen Peterson and the entire HOA board. Financials, meeting minutes, email archives, if we can get a whisper of probable cause for a warrant. Complaints filed against them, by them, lawsuits, liens, the whole 9 yards. I want to know if this boat incident is an outlier or a symptom of a deeper rot." Miller's eyes lit up. He lived for this stuff, the digital breadcrumbs that led to real-world justice. "Consider it done, Sheriff. If there's dirt, I'll find it. If they've so much as jaywalked with malicious intent, it'll be on your desk." The initial witness statement from Ms. Henderson was a start, placing Karen near the scene, agitated. We needed more. Dave Brenner began a canvass of the other marina slip holders and nearby residents, not asking leading questions, just a general inquiry about unusual activity. The fear of Karen was palpable. Many offered nervous denials, eyes darting around as if she might materialize from the azaleas. But a few, emboldened by the sight of uniformed officers and marked cars, began to talk. Whispers of Karen seen pacing the docks late, of raised voices, of her near-obsessive fixation on my boat. One resident, a retiree named Tom Jenkins, who'd had his own run-ins with Karen over a satellite dish, recalled seeing her near my slip, carrying something long and wrapped in a tarp. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. Figured she was finally going to measure my prize-winning marlin against some new HOA fish-length ordinance, he'd grumbled, a flash of bitter humor in his eyes. But now, it clicked into place. A crowbar? A heavy pipe? The pieces were assembling themselves. The malice was clear. The opportunity was there. The emerging pattern of her behavior, the escalating obsession, it all pointed one way. This wasn't just a crime of passion against inanimate fiberglass. This was a calculated act of intimidation, a power play from a woman who couldn't stand being ignored or defied. The thought of her, under the cloak of darkness, adrenaline pumping, repeatedly striking Liberty, fueled by petty rage and a monstrous sense of grievance, it solidified my resolve. This woman was a menace, not just to me, but to the entire community she purported to serve. My boat was merely the latest, most egregious casualty. The investigation was no longer just about a sunk boat. It was about unmasking a tyrant, and I had every intention of stripping her of her self-appointed crown, piece by piece, bylaw by fraudulent bylaw. The cold calm remained, but beneath it, The embers of righteous fury glowed hotter. She thought she was untouchable in her little kingdom. She was about to discover the reach of a far greater jurisdiction. The initial forensic report on Liberty landed on my desk like a lead weight. Multiple impacts, consistent with a heavy, blunt object, possibly a steel bar or pry bar. Significant force used, indicative of deliberate, sustained assault rather than accidental damage. No surprise there. The trace evidence team had lifted some partial prints from the dock railing near my slip, too degraded for an immediate match, but potentially useful for exclusion later, and some unusual fibers caught on a splintered edge of the fiberglass. Fibers that Miller, with his encyclopedic knowledge of obscure details, immediately flagged. "Sheriff," he'd said, holding up a magnified image on his tablet, "these look like high-tensile nylon, possibly from a specific brand of heavy-duty work gloves. The kind often favored by, let's say, overzealous groundskeeping committees." A grim smile touched my lips. Karen Peterson, a woman who wouldn't be caught dead with dirt under her meticulously manicured nails unless it was to bury evidence. The thought was chillingly plausible. We needed more than circumstantial evidence and suggestive fibers, however. We needed to either catch her in a lie, get a confession, or find irrefutable proof linking her directly to the act or its orchestration. My strategy began to form, a multi-pronged approach. First, direct engagement, but carefully controlled. I arranged to casually bump into Karen at the community mailboxes the next morning. I played the part of the aggrieved but still reasonable homeowner. "Karen," I began, my voice carefully neutral, laced with just a hint of dismay. "You heard about my boat, I presume?" Her eyes, usually narrowed in perpetual disapproval, widened with a fraction too much surprise. "Your boat, Mr. Brody? Oh, that dreadful business. I heard some unfortunate rumors. Vandalism, they said? Terrible. Simply terrible what this neighborhood is coming to. The performance was almost convincing if you didn't know her tells." The slight tremor in her left eyelid when she was lying, the way she clasped her hands a little too tightly. "Yes, significant damage," I replied, watching her closely. "Someone took a crowbar or something similar to it. Seems very personal." I let that hang in the air. Her smile was brittle. "Oh, I wouldn't know anything about that. Personal vendettas? Here? Surely not. We're a community, Mr. Brody." The word community dripped with insincerity. I had her on a concealed digital recorder, a standard piece of sheriff's kit. Her denial was noted, her feigned shock recorded. It wasn't a confession, but it was a baseline. Meanwhile, Miller was a digital demon, tearing through the HOA's publicly available records and cross-referencing them with anonymous tips that had suddenly started flowing in. Now, that word of a real investigation was out. Apparently, many residents had been documenting Karen's abuses for years, waiting for a moment, a champion. My sunk boat had become their unlikely rallying cry. "Sheriff, you won't believe this." Miller buzzed into my office later that day, his voice tight with excitement. "Meeting minutes, specifically an executive session 3 days before your boat was hit. Undisclosed agenda item. But I got an anonymous email from a board member, I think using a burner account, claiming the discussion was about problematic residents and asserting HOA authority. Your name was mentioned, Sheriff, repeatedly." My blood ran a little colder. This was premeditated. This wasn't just a fit of pique. This was a coordinated effort, or at least an action sanctioned by her perceived authority. "Anything more specific?" I pressed. The emailer said Karen left that meeting vowing to make an example of someone who thought they were above the rules. Sound familiar? It sounded like a declaration of war. The next step was a warrant for the HOA's internal records, emails, financial statements, full unredacted minutes. For that, I needed to see the DA. Assistant District Attorney Harrison was a cautious man, by the book to a fault. He initially viewed my request with skepticism. "John, a trashed boat is vandalism. A felony, sure. But a fishing expedition into HOA records? That's a stretch without more." I laid it out for him. The forensic report, the witness statements, however circumstantial, the suspicious fibers. the conveniently timed executive session, the anonymous tip from a terrified board member, and finally, I played him the recording of my conversation with Karen, her feigned ignorance, the tremor in her voice. "This isn't just about my boat anymore, Harrison," I said, my voice low and intense. "This is about a pattern of intimidation, abuse of power, and now, a significant felony committed to silence dissent. She didn't just attack my property, she attacked the rule of law in this community. She used the HOA as a weapon." I leaned forward. "And Harrison?" She didn't know who she was attacking. I let that sink in. "The sheriff, the chief law enforcement officer of the county." He looked at the file again, then at me. A slow nod. "All right, John. You've got enough for probable cause. Draft the warrant. Let's see what snakes crawl out when you turn over this rock." The trap was set. The legal gears were grinding. Karen Peterson thought she was playing HOA hardball. She was about to find out she was in a whole different league, a league where the rules were not malleable, and the penalties were far more severe than a sternly worded letter. She thought she was delivering a message. She had no idea of the message she was about to receive. Miller's digital excavation, supercharged by the warrant, was like striking oil. The HOA's internal servers and financial records weren't just a mess, they were a crime scene in spreadsheet form. "Sheriff, it's worse than we thought," he reported, his face grim, illuminated by the glow of his monitors. "This isn't just Karen on a power trip. The whole damn office seems to be in on it, or at least willfully blind and benefiting." He pulled up a series of spreadsheets detailing HOA finances. "Look at this. Consulting fees paid to a company that doesn't exist, traced back to an account owned by Karen's brother-in-law. Inflated invoices for landscaping services from a company where the HOA treasurer, Mr. Abernathy, is a silent partner. And the emergency discretionary fund, it's been systematically bled dry. Payments authorized by Peterson and countersigned by the secretary, Ms. Sixton 70 Evan 8. Periwinkle, for community enhancement projects that have no receipts, no documentation, just vague descriptions. It was a cesspool. My boat, the Catalyst, was now almost a footnote to a much larger conspiracy of fraud, embezzlement, and systemic abuse. The petty tyranny I'd experienced was just the visible tip of a very rotten iceberg. They weren't just bullies, they were crooks, using the HOA as their personal piggy bank and fiefdom. The moral justification for a wider takedown solidified. This wasn't about revenge for liberty anymore, though that wound still throbbed with a cold ache. This was about cleansing a diseased organ within the community. They had preyed on the apathy and fear of ordinary residents, confident in their small pond impunity. They had forgotten that even small ponds exist within a larger ecosystem of law and order. The charges began to stack up in my mind, far beyond malicious destruction of property, conspiracy to commit fraud, embezzlement, potentially wire fraud, given their use of email and online banking. Each meticulously documented instance of financial malfeasance, every email discussing how to handle residents who ask too many questions, every falsified invoice, became another nail in their collective coffin. "Dave," I said, calling Brenner into my office, "I want you to discreetly re-interview every resident who's ever filed a formal complaint against the HOA or Karen Peterson specifically. Look for patterns of intimidation, threats of punitive action, misuse of fines. We're not just building a case for the boat, we're building a case for systemic corruption." Dave nodded, a grim satisfaction in his eyes. "Been waiting for a chance to air out that hornet's nest, Sheriff. A lot of good people have been terrorized by them for years. The evidence for Karen's direct involvement in Liberty's destruction was also firming up. The tarp-wrapped object Tom Jenkins had seen her carrying? Security footage from a hardware store 2 days before the incident showed Karen Peterson purchasing a 3-foot steel pry bar and a pair of heavy-duty nylon work gloves, the exact brand Miller had identified from the fibers. She paid in cash, but the store's loyalty card system, which she'd foolishly used for a discount, recorded the transaction. Her alibi for the night in question, provided to a deputy during a routine follow-up, was that she was home alone, watching television. But her smart thermostat, also subject to the warrant, showed the temperature being manually adjusted downwards around 11:30 p.m., the time Mrs. Henderson saw her storming away from the marina, consistent with someone returning home after strenuous activity. Each piece of evidence was a cold, hard rivet in the case. The decision to target the entire culpable office wasn't made lightly, but the evidence was overwhelming. Karen Peterson was the head of the snake, but the body, the treasurer, the secretary, any board member who knowingly participated or criminally neglected their fiduciary duty was just as venomous. To only remove Karen would be like trimming a weed. The roots would remain. The rot would persist. They thought I was just another disgruntled homeowner, I murmured, looking at the mountain of evidence accumulating on my desk. They thought they could silence me with a thug's tactic, break my spirit by breaking my property. A cold smile played on my lips. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the man they provoked. The weight of my office, the power vested in me by the county, felt heavier now, but not burdensome. It felt like a finely honed weapon, ready to be wielded with precision and righteous force. The scope had expanded, the stakes had risen, but the objective remained clear: justice. Not just for a sunk boat, but for every resident who had been bullied, cheated, and ignored by a corrupt and arrogant HOA board. Their little empire of petty rules and illicit gains was about to come crashing down, and I would be the one to light the fuse. The conversation with Assistant District Attorney Harrison this time was markedly different. Gone was his cautious skepticism, replaced by a grim fascination as I laid out the sprawling case file. It wasn't just about a vandalized boat anymore. It was a portfolio of corruption. "John," he said, leaning back in his chair, the files spread across his desk like a battlefield map. "This is extensive. Embezzlement, conspiracy, fraud, witness intimidation, and that's before we get to the felony destruction of your boat." He tapped a finger on the hardware store receipt for the pry bar, then on the smart thermostat logs. "She's not just a bully, she's a remarkably arrogant criminal." "She and her enablers," I corrected, my voice flat. "Abernathy the treasurer, with his phantom landscaping payouts. Periwinkle the secretary, rubber stamping Karen's discretionary plundering. Any board member who sat through those executive sessions and stayed silent while they planned their next shakedown or cover-up. They're all complicit." Harrison nodded slowly. "The evidence for conspiracy is strong. The financial trail Miller uncovered is damning. We can definitely go after the core group." The legal arsenal was being assembled with meticulous care. Arrest warrants for Karen Peterson, for felony destruction of property, conspiracy to commit fraud, and embezzlement. Arrest warrants for Treasurer Abernathy, for embezzlement and conspiracy. For Secretary Periwinkle, for conspiracy and aiding and abetting embezzlement. Search warrants for their homes, looking for further evidence, assets purchased with stolen funds, any communication that could solidify the conspiracy charges. Each document was drafted with surgical precision, every statute cited, every piece of probable cause clearly articulated. This wasn't going to be a messy, emotional takedown. This was going to be a legally unimpeachable operation. The legally lethal aspect was paramount. We would use the full, unblinking force of the law, executed by the book, leaving no room for procedural error or claims of vindictiveness. The fact that the lead investigator and victim in one of the core charges was the county sheriff added a unique, almost theatrical layer, but it also demanded an even higher standard of impartiality in the execution. My deputies would handle the arrests. I would oversee, but from a necessary professional distance at the point of apprehension. My inner monologue was a constant hum of strategic planning, a counterpoint to the cold fury that still resided deep within. This wasn't just personal anymore, I told myself, though the image of liberty, broken and sinking, was never far from my mind. This was about upholding the oath I took, to protect and serve. That included protecting the citizens of this county from predators, even when those predators wore the guise of HOA officials and wielded bylaws like bludgeons. The badge I wore, usually a symbol of duty and restraint, felt different in this context. It felt like a sharpened instrument, ready for a necessary, if unpleasant, surgery. To excise a cancer from the community, the planning for the arrests was detailed, simultaneous entries at their respective residences and the HOA office. Enough manpower to ensure it was swift, professional, and minimized any chance of escape or destruction of evidence. They crossed a line, I said to Dave Brenner, reviewing the final operational plan. They believed their little world was insulated, that their rules superseded actual laws. They're about to learn, in very stark terms, that they were mistaken. Dave, ever the pragmatist, just nodded. It's going to be a shock to their system, Sheriff. Being on the other side of the handcuffs. A grim thought, but a necessary one. The press would inevitably get wind of it. Sheriff's boat sunk, HOA board arrested. It had all the hallmarks of a local media frenzy. We'd have to manage that, stick to the facts, emphasize the breadth of the alleged crimes beyond just my boat. The narrative had to be about systemic corruption brought to light, not a personal vendetta, even if the spark had been intensely personal. The warrants were signed by a judge late the next afternoon. The paper felt heavy in my hand, each signature a judicial endorsement of the coming storm. Tomorrow morning. Dawn. The traditional hour for unwelcome awakenings. Karen Peterson and her cohort were about to have a very, very bad day. And in the cold, calculating part of my soul, the part that had watched liberty drown, there was a grim, unwavering satisfaction. The law was coming for them, and I was its instrument. The morning air was crisp, the sky just beginning to lighten from inky black to a bruised purple. We briefed in the pre-dawn chill at the county building, a dozen deputies, their faces serious, the steam from their coffee cups rising in the dim light of the briefing room. My voice was low, devoid of emotion, as I laid out the operation, call signs, entry points, responsibilities. Team Alpha, Peterson residence. Team Bravo, Abernathy. Team Charlie, Periwinkle. Team Delta, you're with me. We secure the HOA office. Uniformed presence. By the book. These individuals are to be considered non-violent, but arrogant and potentially uncooperative. Professionalism above all. We are serving lawful warrants. Any deviation, any attempt to obstruct, will be met with appropriate charges. I looked at each of them. They believe they operate outside the normal rules. Today, they discover the rules apply to everyone. The drive to the HOA office, a modest brick building nestled incongruously amongst overly landscaped common areas, was quiet. The convoy of unmarked cars and a single, discreetly marked patrol unit moving with silent purpose. This wasn't a SWAT raid. There would be no battering rams or flashbangs. This was a demonstration of the quiet, inexorable power of the law. The visual would be jarring enough. Uniformed officers, badges gleaming, striding into the mundane heart of their petty kingdom. We timed our arrival at the HOA office for precisely 8:00 a.m., just as the staff would be settling in, Karen likely already holding court. As I stepped out of my vehicle, two of my deputies fanned out to cover the front and rear exits. Dave Brenner was with me. We walked towards the entrance, the glass doors reflecting our grim, determined faces. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed over a scene of banal bureaucracy. Miss Periwinkle was at her desk, already typing furiously. Mr. Henderson, a newer, younger board member who Miller's investigation suggested was more a bewildered pawn than a conspirator, was nervously sipping coffee. And there, in her glass-walled office, like a queen surveying her realm, was Karen Peterson. She looked up as we entered, her expression shifting from imperious expectation to confusion, then to a flicker of something that might have been alarm as she registered the uniforms and my unsmiling face. I walked directly to her office door, Dave at my shoulder. She stood, a frown etching itself onto her features. Sheriff Brody, what is the meaning of this? If this is about your boat, I assure you, the HOA is not responsible for private marina. I held up a hand, palm out, silencing her mid-sentence. The abruptness of it clearly shocked her. Karen Peterson. My voice was cold, formal, echoing slightly in the suddenly silent office. You are under arrest for felony destruction of property, conspiracy to commit fraud and embezzlement. I nodded to Dave, who stepped forward, handcuffs at the ready. Her face went from pale to mottled red. Arrest me, Are you insane? On what grounds? This is outrageous. I am the president of this homeowners association. You can't just... We can, I stated, my voice cutting through her rising hysteria. And we are. We have a warrant signed by Judge Miller. I produced the document, holding it for her to see, though I doubted she could focus on the legal script. Her eyes were wide, darting between me, Dave, and the handcuffs he now held loosely. This is a mistake, a misunderstanding. You have no proof. I will sue you. I will sue the entire county. Do you know who I am? Her voice was becoming a shriek. My response was deadpan, each word delivered with surgical precision. Yes, Miss Peterson, we know exactly who you are. And soon, a judge and jury will know too. Dave took her arm gently but firmly. Please turn around, ma'am. The click of the handcuffs was a small, definitive sound in the otherwise stunned silence of the office. Ms. Periwinkle looked like she was about to faint. Mr. Henderson just stared, mouth agape. Simultaneously, across town, similar scenes were playing out at the Abernathy and Periwinkle residences. The reports started trickling in over the radio. Bravo has Abernathy in custody. Charlie has Periwinkle secured. My deputies began the methodical search of the HOA office, bagging evidence, seizing computers and boxes of files. The drone surveillance metaphor felt apt, a complete, top-down sweep of their operations. This was the tactical retaliation, executed not with explosives, but with the unyielding force of legal process. Karen, now cuffed, was sputtering, a torrent of threats, denials, and accusations of a personal vendetta. I ignored her, turning to the stunned Mr. Henderson. Mr. Henderson, we have a warrant to search these premises for evidence pertaining to financial crimes and conspiracy. We would appreciate your cooperation. He just nodded dumbly, the fight completely gone from him. The carefully constructed facade of the HOA, its aura of untouchable authority, was crumbling before his eyes. The Queen was dethroned, her castle breached, her reign of petty tyranny brought to an abrupt, ignominious end. The walk from the HOA office to the waiting patrol car was Karen Peterson's first taste of public reckoning. Handcuffed, her usually immaculate hair slightly disheveled, her face a mask of incandescent rage and disbelief, she was escorted past a growing crowd of onlookers. Neighbors, drawn by the sight of multiple official vehicles and the undeniable aura of serious business, had begun to gather at a respectful distance. Their expressions were a mixture of shock, hushed whispers, and for some, a dawning, almost incredulous relief. The silent majority, who had endured her reign in resentful quiet, were witnessing the impossible. Their tormentor, the self-styled queen of the cul-de-sac, was being led away like a common criminal, which, of course, she now was. Treasurer Abernathy and Secretary Periwinkle, looking pale and deflated, arrived in separate cars shortly after, their own perp walks less dramatic but equally symbolic. The booking process at the county jail was a study in the great leveling power of the law. Mugshots were taken, Karen's a defiant glare, Abernathy's a portrait of bewildered resignation, Periwinkle's tear-streaked and terrified. Fingerprints were inked and rolled. Their designer clothes and positions of minor authority meant nothing here. They were just another set of accused felons entering the system. The stripping away of their perceived power was palpable. Karen's demands to speak to her lawyer, to the mayor, to God himself, were met with polite, procedural indifference by the booking sergeant, a man who had seen it all and was impressed by none of it. "You'll get your phone call, ma'am, just like everyone else," he'd said, his voice devoid of sympathy. Meanwhile, the search of the HOA office was yielding a treasure trove. Boxes of shredded documents hastily dumped in a back closet, not shredded finely enough. Our forensic accountants would later piece much of it together. Hard drives that Miller's team immediately began to mirror. A hidden ledger in Karen's desk, detailing off-book cash payments from violation fines. A slush fund she apparently used for personal expenses. The local news, alerted by anonymous calls, likely from gleeful residents, had arrived, cameras rolling. The headline practically wrote itself. HOA president and board members arrested in shocking corruption scandal. Sheriff's boat incident sparks wider probe. On-screen text would soon flash the charges. The names, The sheer audacity of it all. I gave a brief, carefully worded statement to the press outside the county building later that day. This morning, members of the Community Name Homeowners Association Board were arrested on multiple charges, including embezzlement, conspiracy to commit fraud, and in the case of Miss Karen Peterson, felony destruction of property. The investigation is ongoing. This office is committed to rooting out corruption wherever it exists and holding accountable those who betray the public trust, regardless of their position. I didn't mention my boat specifically in that statement. The investigation had grown far beyond that single malicious act. Liberty was the spark, but the inferno was their own making. The arrest warrants, the news headlines, these were the first flames of their public immolation. Inside the interrogation rooms, the united front of the HOA board began to crumble. Periwinkle, faced with the evidence of her complicity and the stark reality of jail time, was the first to break, her tearful confession painting a vivid picture of Karen's domineering control and Abernathy's willing participation in the financial schemes. Abernathy, a man who clearly fancied himself a shrewd operator, tried to bluster, then, confronted with irrefutable bank records and vendor kickback schemes, began to negotiate, hoping to save his own skin. Karen, however, remained defiant, a cornered viper spitting venom. She denied everything, blamed everyone else, accused me of a personal vendetta, of abusing my power. Her narcissism was a shield, deflecting all responsibility. But the evidence was a battering ram, and her shield was cracking. The satisfaction I felt was cold, grim, but profound. It wasn't joy. It was the somber contentment of a surgeon who has successfully removed a malignant tumor. The operation was brutal, the recovery would be long, but the disease was being excised. The psychological closure wasn't quite there yet. That would come with convictions. But the locked gate of their impunity had been kicked wide open. The blood, metaphorically speaking, was the moral cost of inaction, a cost the community had been paying for years. Today, the bleeding stopped. The initial court appearances were a spectacle of deflated arrogance. Karen Peterson, flanked by a high-priced lawyer who looked like he'd rather be defending organized crime figures, stood before Judge Ramirez, her face a stony mask. The prosecutor, A.D.A. Harrison himself, laid out the charges with chilling clarity, requesting significant bail given the severity of the financial crimes and the violence of the property destruction. Bail was set high, a figure that clearly shocked Karen, whose expression momentarily faltered. Abernathy and Periwinkle, looking smaller and grayer than they ever had in the HOA office, were granted bail at lower amounts, conditional on surrendering their passports and having no contact with other defendants or HOA members. The Homeowners Association itself was thrown into immediate disarray. With its president, treasurer, and secretary arrested, it was effectively decapitated. The remaining board members, mostly newer appointees or those on the periphery of Karen's inner circle, were left scrambling, facing a bewildered and angry populace of homeowners who were just beginning to understand the extent of the alleged corruption. My office was, of course, inundated with calls. Media inquiries, which my PIO handled with practiced ease, sticking to the facts of the ongoing investigation. Calls from grateful residents, some tearful, thanking us for finally lancing the boil. And, predictably, a formal inquiry from the state's Internal Affairs Oversight Committee, triggered automatically by any criminal investigation where a law enforcement officer is a primary victim or instigator of the charges. I welcomed it. My actions had been by the book, the evidence meticulously gathered, the warrants legally sound. The Internal Affairs Review, which concluded swiftly, found no misconduct, only commendable police work. Liberty still sat in the marina, cordoned off, a silent, waterlogged testament to the catalyst of this whole affair. The insurance adjusters had been, their faces grim. She was a total loss. The cost to repair would exceed her value. She was now, officially, Exhibit A. Looking at her, I felt a pang, not of anger anymore, but of a somber resolve. Her sacrifice had not been in vain. She had been the line in the sand. The process of justice is slow, often frustratingly so, but it is inexorable. The arraignments were followed by a flurry of legal motions from the defense attorneys. motions to dismiss, motions to suppress evidence, all standard tactics, all meticulously countered by Harrison's team. The weight of evidence was simply too great. The financial records, the witness testimonies, the forensic findings, Karen's ill-advised hardware store purchase. It formed an unbreakable chain. The subtle shift in the neighborhood was remarkable. The oppressive atmosphere of fear and petty regulation began to lift. People started talking to each other again, not in hushed whispers about Karen's latest edict, but openly about rebuilding their community, about forming a new, transparent, and accountable HOA. The fear was being replaced by a tentative hope, a sense of empowerment. Some residents even organized a small, informal gathering at the marina, not to mourn liberty, but to thank me, quietly, for what I had done. I appreciated the sentiment, but deflected the praise. I was just doing my job, I told them, a job that sometimes extended to my own backyard. The fight wasn't over. Trials loomed, but the immediate threat had been neutralized. The architects of the local tyranny were facing the cold, impartial machinery of the law they had so arrogantly disregarded. There was a certain grim poetry to it. They had sought to control every blade of grass, every paint chip, every aspect of their neighbors' lives. Now their own lives were utterly out of their control, subject to the dictates of courts and lawyers and the looming possibility of prison. The porchlight of community trust had been dimmed by their actions. Now, there was a chance to turn it back on, brighter than before. The trials, when they finally came, were less dramatic than the arrests, more a methodical presentation of the overwhelming evidence we had compiled. Periwinkle, having cooperated fully, received a reduced sentence, probation and community service, her career and reputation in tatters. Abernathy, facing the undeniable proof of his embezzlement schemes, pleaded guilty to several charges in exchange for a shorter prison term than he might otherwise have received. He'd served 3 years, a broken man stripped of his ill-gotten gains. Karen Peterson, however, fought to the bitter end. Her defense attorney threw every Hail Mary pass he could conjure, attempting to paint her as a misunderstood community leader, a victim of a personal vendetta orchestrated by an overzealous sheriff. It didn't fly. The jury, presented with the hardware store footage, the thermostat data, the damning financial records, and the testimony of her former Confederates, saw through the charade. The conviction, when it came, was on all major counts: felony destruction of property, embezzlement, conspiracy. The judge, citing her utter lack of remorse and the calculated malice of her actions, sentenced her to 7 years in state prison. 7 years. The number hung in the courtroom. Karen's face, for the first time, truly crumbled. The arrogant facade dissolving into raw, ugly despair. There was no satisfaction in that sight for me, only the grim acknowledgement of a necessary outcome. The old HOA was dissolved, its charter revoked. A new one was formed, with interim leadership appointed by a consortium of concerned residents, many of whom had been the silent majority for so long. They drafted new bylaws, focused on actual community well-being rather than punitive control. The meetings were open, the finances transparent. A new dawn, of sorts. With the insurance money and some of my own savings, I bought a new boat, slightly larger, a little more modern, but with the same spirit of freedom and family that Liberty had embodied. We christened her Justice. It felt appropriate. My family and I took her out on her maiden voyage on a crisp autumn afternoon. The water was calm, the sky a brilliant blue. The kids were laughing. Sarah was smiling. And for the first time, in a long time, the tension that had unknowingly settled in my shoulders began to ease. The locked gate of this particular chapter was finally, truly, psychologically closed. The experience had changed me, subtly. It reinforced my belief in the system, in the power of the law when wielded correctly, but it also left a residue of weariness. The fight against petty tyrants and corrupt officials is never truly over. There will always be those who seek to abuse power, to exploit others for their own gain. But there will also always be those who stand against them. My final thought, as I looked back at the shoreline, at the community slowly healing, was a quiet hope. I trusted the new bylaws, under the new leadership, would be meticulously observed, not out of fear, but out of a shared respect for fairness and decency. The moral cost of inaction had been high, paid by many. The moral authority to act, when finally seized, had been absolute. The echoes of Karen's shrieked, "Do you know who I am?" still sometimes played in my mind. And I'd think, yes, I did. And now, so does the state correctional system. And that, in the end, was all the justice liberty required. The water lapped gently against the hull of justice, a soothing sound, a promise of calmer seas ahead.